what actually has the US achieved or has the US won in this deal?
If this goes
Yeah.
south, um, they're going to look at this as an albatross around those who are tied to the administration.
President Trump knows very well the kind of position he's putting Netanyahu in at home, and he did it anyway.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The President's Path. And this week, Bernd and I are delighted once again to welcome our good friend Finn Gomez to join us. Finn, of course, is the political director and executive editor of White House and political coverage at CBS News, our sister organization here in the US, just a couple of doors down from us on the street as well, Finn. So we're neighbors as well as friends.
It's great to be here.
Welcome
Always
back,
nice to have
Finn.
a podcast. Thank you, Vern. Appreciate y'all. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know if it's deja vu the last time you were with us, but it feels like every week we're saying deal or no deal about Iran. And this week we can say, as of now anyway, we do have a deal. It's been signed by President Trump, witnessed by most of the G7 leaders and many others at a very swanky dinner at the Palace of Versailles at the end of the G7 meeting. And now the clock starts ticking on these 60 days for the bigger negotiations, which the Vice President JD Vance confirmed on Thursday that the 60-day ticker started from then, which brings us, I think, to like the 17th of August or something like that. But a bit of progress anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's been a pretty tumultuous roller coaster of a ride for the last couple of months in before getting to this point, this crucial point, seemingly. We just found out what's in the MOU as of yesterday, or excuse me, earlier this week, and I think the uh, I think there's still a lot of questions surrounding its impact and its motivation, and specifically why now. But it is generating some hope, at least within the White House. The sources that I've spoken to, some of them quite senior, that this could help end this, and also, um, frankly, there's a political factor as well with the midterm so close that could potentially improve overall the Republicans' perspective when it comes to that as well, and chances.
I thought it was really telling when JD Vance addressed reporters at the White House in the briefing room that one of the first things he pointed to was the Strait of Hormuz being open and the number of ships passing through it, and the price of gas falling below $4 a gallon again, which I think just shows how important this was for them domestically to get that messaging out there as quickly as possible. Because we discussed this on the pod before, the polling over this war and the economic factors that Americans were dealing with at the petrol pump, they weren't looking good for the White House. So I thought it was interesting that they came right out of the gate with that as one of the overarching achievements of, they say, of this deal. But I think critics of the White House and the Trump administration will point to the somewhat obvious fact that the Strait of Hormuz was closed and gas prices were high because the Trump administration chose to initiate Operation Epic Fury back in late February. So I think that's something we'll be hearing quite a lot about from critics of the Trump administration and from Democrats as we kind of push towards the midterm, even if those prices keep going down.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's the central point listening to people who know a
Yes.
lot more about these kind of matters than I do is what actually has the US achieved or has the US won in this deal? Yes, there's a piece of paper, and we saw the president put his signature on it with a big Sharpie on Wednesday night. But, as you say, Bernd, the strait was open before all of this began. Petrol prices were a lot lower than they are now. And all of those major substantive issues still have to be discussed and agreed upon, the biggest of which being Iran's kind of nuclear program and nuclear capacity and inspections and what it's going to have or not have. None of that's been resolved. That all is still left up to discussions in the next 60 days, or potentially, and even the president kind of acknowledged this during the week, potentially a lot longer than that.
And I thought it was interesting. When this deal was first announced, they used the term down blending, which I think to people that haven't really been following makes it seem like that's quite a straightforward process to dilute the highly enriched uranium in place inside Iran. And 60 days is an incredibly accelerated timeline for what is ultimately a very, very technical scientific discussion. Some of people watching might remember that in the Obama administration, those negotiations took 20 months. I mean, this isn't something that can necessarily be hashed out in just 2 months. And I think, we're starting to see the administration kind of acknowledge that that's such a short timeline, and we might need to kind of adjust that as things go. There's also just the logistical part of the equipment needed for such a thing needs to be put in place. It's not clear that Iran has it. Trump says that the U.S. has it, but then Iran needs to agree to have that in place in Iran, and then the IAEA monitors, who they say will be looking into this, need to be in place as well. So I think 60 days seems very, very optimistic to a lot of people who are watching this for the
Yeah,
nuclear issue, at least.
I think you're right. And I mean, and just to your point earlier, Katrina, I mean, the president had said repeatedly that the goal here was uh, um, to essentially impact the nuclear capabilities of Iran to a degree that they're not a threat anymore. And it does not seem like that part of the mission statement, that earlier goal, has been achieved here. And I think that's something that has raised the eyebrows from even some of his Republican allies. However, with Vice President Vance being the face of this, I had talked to some senior sources close to the White House, close to Vance, who do believe that there's an upside to this as well. Again, looking at the political motivations behind this, which I think is where we have to start. Like, why now? I think this is the pressing issue. We talked about it. The midterms are coming up, and this is something that is crucial for them. Look, we know that any prolonged engagement hurts that effort. Any prolonged engagement continues to impact gas prices. Gas prices will still be impacted because it does, as we just discussed, it takes a long time to kind of disentangle and get to a place where everyone's happy. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that Vice President Vance, what I'm told, jumped into this to be the face of it, not only because it could potentially help with their efforts in surrounding 2026, but because even if the MOU fails, it still could benefit Vance politically even past 26, right? If he does run for president, and he would be seen as the voice within the administration of really trying to get back to that sort of America first, more isolationist type of perspective that that Trump and Vance ran on in 2024. They have to worry about their base. Their base is with them right now, but there has been some erosion over the gas prices, over the continued affordability issues, and over their uneasiness with foreign entanglements. This is again this was a major issue during the 2024 campaign. The president said over and over that he would not be involved in nation building and would not want to. He basically ran with an anti-war message, and so that's going against that. So it would be interesting to see the impact it has on his base voters in particular. But for Vance allies, they do see this as something that could potentially benefit him, even if the memo of understanding doesn't work.
But Finn, if this all ultimately goes pear-shaped and fails, and I mean, President Trump was saying, "Oh, if we have no agreement at the end of the 60 days, we'll go bombing again," and then he later said, "Oh, maybe we won't," or words to that effect. But if it all goes terribly wrong to a worst-case scenario where the US is really dragged into this, isn't it then JD Vance's face and name that's associated with it?
I think he sees, if you look ahead, this could be a political issue in 28, right? If this goes
Yeah.
south, um, they're going to look at this as an albatross around those who are tied to the administration and who is closer to the administration than the vice president and former running mate. So if he if he's successful in establishing space between that and the ability to have some armor over those potential criticisms and critiques that may come in that fashion, I think it does benefit him, though. I think it could, and I think people around him believe that too, because at least he was the one who tried, right? At least
Yeah.
we know that internally he's been at the table, not wanting to, almost the contrarian, with some of the others in the room who understand that he understands that. I think he has the best understanding of where the base is, and especially if he jumps into 28. So I think if he's seen as more aligned with them, it helps.
One wonders then also how it leaves Marco Rubio, who, despite being Secretary of State, I mean, he's never really been the face of this conflict. He's not been really, one of the main negotiators. He's not really been the one selling it to the US public. So I think it also kind of works in that same way for him to a certain extent, even though he's perhaps not, from a starting point, less closely aligned with the MAGA base, just given his history in the Republican Party. I mean, I think if this goes badly, then I mean, ultimately he comes out of this relatively unscathed, because he's never been in a position where he has to own this conflict. Even if he has, for example, he did the briefing at the White House, for example, where he really tried sell the U.S. public on why this war started and how the negotiations were going at the time. He's really never been kind of the Iran war guy to the same extent that J.D. Vance has.
Yeah, Marco Rubio has really sort of put himself in the box of being the Venezuela guy or the Cuba guy, depending what happens with Cuba, because there's definitely, I'm sure you've heard it as well, a very strong rumor around this town that some sort of US invasion is imminent in Cuba, which we have spoken about before.
Mhm.
But if we look at the other issue that kind of bubbled up at the G7 this week as well, was Ukraine coming back to the fore.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the president's opponents, even erstwhile allies within the Republican Party, have kind of been screaming at him for months now. We have to help Ukraine. What are we going to do? And suddenly we see President Trump talking again about it, talking about a summit between Putin and Zelensky here in the US, even.
Yeah, and it has, like, and I think that the recent successes, militaristic successes by Ukraine has also, um, I think, helped foment some of that newfound push within the administration. I think I think part of his calculus is, with anything, when it comes to politics, when it comes to foreign policy, is who appears to be the safer bet, who appears to be the side that is looking like it's winning. It's part of his, it's part of his calculus. It's part of it, that proximity. He understands. I mean, when he endorses candidates in Republican primaries, he does that. And so I think, and he also tries to apply it. He's applied it in his past business experiences as well. He writes about it in The Art of the Deal. If you look at it now, though, I think even from this vantage point, as the president of the United States, as the commander in chief, and with his what the Don Roe doctrine that he calls it, I think he is also seeing the gains by the Ukrainians, and seeing that it's not it's not so black and white, and I think his calculus is changing, and so I do think that it could foment, potentially, some movement in a positive direction for trying to ease that front as well with the Ukraine and Russia.
I think at the same time, while they're publicly optimistic, the administration seems to have come to an acknowledgement over the last few months that this war in particular is very, very difficult to solve. I remember very clearly being at the White House last year, and there was times when they said, "Oh, we could get a ceasefire next week. There's peace negotiations right around the corner." And that never really happened. And the Ukraine war kind of has remained, President Trump always points to the wars he says he solved. The Ukraine war remains kind of the one that seems furthest away. And I think even in his public statements, you're starting to see that, he's said many times now, this was the war I thought would be easiest to solve, and it's been the hardest. And, just at the G7 on his way there, he said, ultimately, this war isn't one that impacts Americans. It's very far away. So he's been much more cautious in the way he talks about the war, and both sides, than he was towards the beginning of his administration, when he really did seem very confident that that war was probably not that difficult to solve.
It's very unpopular with his base. His base finds it very unpopular engagement. So I think it's more of a nuisance at times, politically and externally.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because with his fellow Republicans, many of them see pushing back against Russia as a really urgent thing to do, and the sort of alienation of the European allies that we've seen over Ukraine, but also over Greenland. Whereas among the base, as you're saying, Finn, that's a more fractious one than the Iranian conflict is.
I would agree. I think in terms of, yes, I mean, I think if you look at the compass of the base, if you will, that registers less. It's more diminished than other fronts. I think you mentioned Greenland, of course. We haven't talked about Greenland in a while, but
Yeah,
it's true. I mean,
still there.
they still talk about it on, if you go to
Yeah.
some of these competitive states as well, and you talk to Republican voters. But also, I mean, I think Cuba. We talked about Cuba before, and yes, Marco Rubio has been really involved in that. And yes, there's been reporting about maybe an imminent um, some sort of action against them by the United States. I think that also, that's something that Marco Rubio has wanted to do for a long time, but it's also something that I think gets a pass with the base, right? Because there's a lot, they recognize that it's been a target of not just on a foreign policy perspective, but politically for decades, right? 90 miles away from the south of Florida,
Yeah.
communist run regime. And I think if there is action there, I think that would be one that would be more supportive, definitely by, of course, voters in southern Florida, where there's as we know, a higher proportion of Cuban Americans and Venezuelans, and you're already seeing some impact by the Venezuela with Venezuelan American communities in South Florida, how they've been very pro that, so that has actually registered to be more prone to support Republicans. So it's interesting, and I would just want to flag that as well. That Cuba is something continue to be watching.
And the other one, of course, which we didn't touch on when we were talking about Iran a few moments ago, but it's important as well, is the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mean, we've really seen
Yeah.
a deterioration in that this week, alongside what we've seen in polls for months now, which is a deterioration in the support for Israel here as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the headlines of this past week has been that, like, the deterioration publicly now, because there's
Yeah,
been, we've
the
been hearing
language
sort of,
is crazy.
yeah, the language, and he's, and the president telling, not mincing words, and including some expletives to show his disdain for some of Netanyahu's decisions, and I think that is extremely notable, right? That's like really, this is the two world leaders. Then when they've met before, there's been just, they've been just the opposite of what the president said. So you could see how much this relationship seemingly has devolved. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the future? What does that mean? There's been
Yeah.
criticism out of Israel too for like not being involved in the negotiations here with this MOU. Potentially discussing, it, their efforts with Lebanon, and how does that, are you defanging this important ally in the Middle East, but at the same time, is the president also showcasing, he's got a great political year, and he knows that there's been a lot of increase in American voters having issues with the Israeli government.
Yeah.
And so I think, is that a consideration? Perhaps. I know the Democrats have been running on it as part of their strategy in the midterms. So it is. I think it's really notable. Really notable.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was going to make. You know, when you look at the polling about U.S. perceptions towards Israel, it's the disapproval rate of Israeli actions has never been higher in the United States, and I think it's actually one
Yeah.
of those rare things where there's a chunk of people on the right, very much, you know, even many within that MAGA base, and a chunk of people kind of on the far left of the Democrats really agree, broadly speaking, on questioning the U.S. security relationship with Israel and the amount of money and uh, assets given to Israel or sold to Israel. I think, you know, even if he didn't mean it as a domestic political benefit, ultimately putting daylight between the White House and Netanyahu's government in Israel could ultimately just happen organically, even if he's not necessarily something he's looking for. And I think it's also, you know, President Trump's never been shy about weighing in on other countries' domestic politics. Even in Israel, we saw him kind of chime in when Netanyahu was facing legal issues. But for him to put Netanyahu in such a tricky domestic situation in which, you know, hardliners are upset at him for perceiving him as listening too much to President Trump. And, you know, he's always framed himself as a security first prime minister, and damaging the relationship with the US makes that pretty tricky. President Trump knows very well the kind of position he's put Netanyahu in at home, and he did it anyway. And I think that's kind of remarkable that it happens, you know, so quickly. I mean, it's been weeks of this, but the deterioration just seemed to happen very, very quickly once
Yes.
you know, there was light at the end of the tunnel with the Iran MOU.
And I think you're seeing what happens when you have two very powerful leaders up, facing elections. Obviously, President Trump himself not facing elections, but notionally the Republican Party is, so he is in the US. Netanyahu and his party facing elections in Israel. They both have to protect what's happening domestically, but they have this sort of common purpose that they've engaged on together. And you sort of where all those Venn diagrams interact, and ultimately, what do they care more about as a power in their country, or what they're doing beyond that? And the potential for what is happening in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah to scupper that Iran US deal, I think really possibly was the tipping point for President Trump. He's in control of so many factors, but not that one.
So I think perfectly put, Katrina. And I think, and really, Hezbollah and really becomes a flashpoint that we should be watching now. A narrative out of this MOU, like how is that going to be impacted? And yeah, the bigger point is the U.S.-Israeli relationships. I suspect that they'll come to a point of they'll make peace within their own sort of
Pick up again.
yeah. Look, the president also, that's part of but that's a part of his like negotiating tactics in the past, has been to utilize the press to get his message out, to kind of to be aggressive in certain statements and then cajole in others. We've seen it in his positioning on Iran throughout the months. It's changed. It changes. So I
Yeah.
think maybe it could have been a ploy to get him to kind of tell him, hey, put him in line. Don't do this again. And I know there are other channels, but by doing so publicly, he's making a point of saying it where he says it.
But yeah.
That's really one to watch. It's going to get really interesting. It's kind of like a political telenovela. So I think we'll keep an eye on that, in my opinion.
Well, we'll see where we're at this time next week as the clock is ticking down on those 60 days to get a more permanent deal between the US and Iran. We will no doubt be talking about it as well with whatever else happens in the next week. Great to see you both, Finn. Great to have you on with us again.
I love being on. This is great. Always, it's like chatting with a group of friends at a bar or something like that. It's great.
If
Really
only we were at a bar, though.
enjoy it. Yes, it'd be better.
Always a pleasure, Finn. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, guys.
And you can catch up with all the episodes of The President's Path on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK, or on YouTube if you're anywhere else in the world.
And if you want to get in touch, please do. You can email us at path@bbc.co.uk.